think one of the biggest things that we've got to be aware of is that fiscal policy and policy in general from the government is going to have an impact on basically everyone. That's where the big, beautiful bill comes into play. This is something I learned in a very negative sense. My wife was pregnant with twins and she had a stroke. And so what ended up happening is she had a stroke. We had pretty good insurance, but there was a couple different factors around policy, government policy, protecting insurance companies so that at the time, this is 2018, she actually had another one again last year in 2024, is that you end up having a doctor having you stay in the hospital for an extended period of time, and then they get extra tests called in, and then you have all these extra procedures, and the insurance company ends up saying that they don't need these procedures, and these are actually protected policies from the federal government. So what ends up happening is we end up spending a lot of money out of pocket while my wife was pregnant with twins, and that's the federal policy that we needed to be familiar with to try and prevent these things from happening. We didn't know it. So in the realm of the big, beautiful bill, I think it's really important that we're looking at the simple exchange with the government, right? So when we're looking at, okay, you've got to have higher income than expenses if you're an individual, in most cases, at least that's the goal financially when we're thinking about normal people. We'd like to think the same thing for the government. Now, that isn't the case, and what ends up occurring is that for a federal government, or any government for that matter, to successfully be able to support the constituents and the people around them, they need to be able to pay for simple things like what I deem as the 5 main purposes of the government. Okay, and I think it's important that we all recognize that there is indeed purpose of the government, and one would be defense. Okay, so we need to be able to protect our constituents and support them and have security around them. So we're looking at defense, we're looking at, I believe there should be some type of plans for elderly and poor, okay? I think that that's another thing that can be an important thing that every just, I would say every just government should have factored in to some extent, because it's not something that we can ignore. Another thing that we should have a discussion on is infrastructure. How much is the federal government versus the state and local government responsible for specific roadways, electricity access, internet, things like that that you need to survive, right? I think these are all important aspects, especially in the economy today. And I think that along those lines, you would have some discussion around healthcare, which we do with Medicaid currently, things like that. Even SNAP to a point could fall under the healthcare discussion. In other countries, they would have universal healthcare. So this is another aspect. So we're looking at, again, what I see is infrastructure, healthcare, elderly and poor under another thing, defense, and then finally, what I believe is probably the 5th thing right now, we would be looking at debt and managing debt. And so if we're managing debt, we have to look at what the issue is that we would be as a country, potentially paying a massive amount of debt, and if we're not reaping enough reward from our revenue from taxes and things like that, you have to have these other plans. And so some people will have these strategic plans. Trumpsky here has a plan, and he's selling it as though, okay, if we cut all these taxes, and there's some really unique things that can be quite beneficial for business owners and things along those lines, is that if we can cut this stuff, the theory is that over time, more companies are made, bigger companies are made, more people get employed, and then they would, in theory, pay more taxes on a gross scale, on a much larger scale, which in turn would increase the tax revenue, which would decrease, or at least minimize the deficit that we currently have with the budget. And so the issue with this big, beautiful bill is that I like to look at it and split it into those 5 sectors, and that's going to help us actually understand what each sector is doing for normal people. But then also, I like to think through that lens of, is this going to increase the revenue for the government to provide those 5 key sectors? And the sad part is right now, last year, we actually paid more towards the debt than we did towards defense. And if that's the case right now, how are we planning for the future? So a couple big factors here. The right off the bat, the way that I think that this is going to impact normal people, okay? So the first thing, the big popular thing was no tax on wages, no tax on overtime, and no tax on tips. So I think it's important to understand up to $25,000 is for each is what we're going to be seeing here now, and this is in the big beautiful bill. I have a couple notes because there's quite a bit. 940 pages of a bill for the small government people. We love to say we're small government, but then we make 940-page bills. So if we go back to it and look at, we can see that if you make under $500,000, you can expand the SALT deduction up to $40,000, okay? So from 10K to 40K. So that's state and local taxes can then get deducted from your federal tax bill. So if you make 200K, right, let's say, you can, and then you spend, let's just say 40K, the maximum, in state and local taxes, what ends up happening is you can take that 40K, subtract it off of your earnings, and that you would now be taxed on the $160,000. Now, regarding the overtime stuff with the tips as well, that's going to be another thing that I think some people are confused about, is that they think like, oh, well, if I get $25,000, I just get to keep that in my pocket. Not necessarily. The way it's built out is essentially if you have 100K and then you get $25,000 of tips, that gets deducted off of your base salary. So there's like some interesting ways, and I think they're still not overly clear on all this stuff on how it's going to go about happening. And some other stuff, there's going to be some stuff around if you buy a vehicle that is assembled in the United States, finally assembled, meaning all parts put together in the United States. I think it's a $6,000 removal or a $6,000 credit, tax credit. So that's another thing that I do think can contribute towards the entirety of what normal people would be expecting, right? Now, when we're talking about a lot of normal people, states like West Virginia, okay, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Kentucky, these are oftentimes the poorest states in the entire country, right? And so these are the states that we're going to see things. So if you have Medicaid or SNAP, what we're seeing part of this BBB is that you're going to have some issues where you have to mandatorily, or it's a mandatory issue that you have to work 20 hours a week for 80 hours a month to be able to receive food stamps, which is SNAP, or Medicaid. Now, if you have a kid under the age of 14, that's not necessary. But if you have a kid and you're a single parent that's 15 years old, you got to work 20 hours a week. I actually don't hate this. I don't hate it. I think it's actually not bad. Now, they are claiming, the problem is going to be, they're claiming that they have ways of, if somebody is disabled and things like this, and so this would fall under that sector of poor and elderly, that if you're under the age of 65 and you're disabled, they're going to have things in place to make sure that you indeed can, you don't have to work and stuff like that. The problem I have with stuff along those lines is it becomes a very big gray area, and the people who might be making the ruling aren't always going to be the best, right? And so you're relying on the government to make good rulings in that case. Now, I think another thing that we can look through is that in regards to defense, an interesting thing I thought about here was that they're building, I think it was $50 billion towards the border down in Mexico. They're 30 billion or 300 billion. I don't know, the numbers are insane for the Golden Dome. So that's another huge project. There's a lot of stuff going towards defense. And so in that regard, the way I thought about this, I keep thinking through like, how does a normal person, what do they think about with this? The first step I had in my mind was, well, we should find out who the companies are that they're probably going to be hiring for the fence, for the wall, and for the Golden Dome. Palantir is probably going to be somebody on the forefront that they're going to be using for all these different defense issues. So that was some of the interesting thoughts that I had along those lines. Now, there is going to be things for normal people like the child tax credit. That gets bumped up to $2,250. So that would be factored probably into, where would I put that? Not into healthcare. I would probably put that somewhere, maybe I would put that into healthcare, but that's a positive there that we are seeing. No tax on tips, 25 to 20, and that's going to be 2025 to 2028. Overtime pay is actually $12,500. The clean energy tax credit is getting removed. We're getting a tax break on fossil fuels. That's the stuff that's just so mind-boggling to me. It's like, why are we remove the tax credit for clean energy? Dude, I don't care. Go ahead and do that. Do it. But if we're talking about fair market stuff, why are we giving tax breaks to fossil fuel companies? That's the stuff that drives me nuts. It's like, I'm sitting here going like, okay, so now we want to increase revenue as a company. And I want to bring this up is that one thing they're doing too is that they're actually making all R&D deductible from profits for companies. And I can relate to this because in my company that I own, okay, we own a SaaS company, and our SaaS company spends a lot of money on R&D every single year. A massive amount of our profit goes back into R&D. And so I do like that factor because it makes it, one, we have to be more concise with our R&D, and then two, this is an investment into the company, and three, it makes me as the CEO more willing to actually spend that money on R&D. So that is something that I do think could be a positive in the sense of like, we might spend an extra, 50 to 100K a year, which could be 1.5 jobs or maybe a half a job or a job for, depending on the actual SaaS or the software that we're trying to design. So I do think stuff like that is important, especially for a smaller level company to be able to handle that. It still doesn't pull away from the fact that we're borrowing from the future to pay for some of the things today. And I think that's my biggest concern. Now, another thing I found that normal people might be interested in here is that with the expanded opportunity zone inside of real estate. So what that means is if you have extra income and you're able to pay off all of your bills, or you can, you've paid most of your one mortgage off and you have access to funding and you want to start a rental property somewhere in an identified opportunity zone, you can get good tax credits from that expanded opportunity zone, which will help revitalize specific areas. Now, the downfall with stuff like that is that who's determining these expanded opportunity zones, right? This is a very specific issue sometimes. Now, going back to the discussion about the poorer states, okay? So if you have a poorer state like West Virginia, okay, where you have a lot of people that are using Medicaid, you have a lot of people using SNAP, and there's not a lot of opportunity. One of the issues I did have there is that now we're putting a lot of pressure on these states that don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of industry. And we're not thinking through what that will mean for them. I think that's a thing that we've got to think through. Now, small company or small level deductions, QBI, qualified business income, deduct portions, 23% of the QBI is an improvement, which will help businesses with more money. Service trades might not qualify with this, so we got to think through like renovating and building properties, stuff like that. That will qualify. That's another thing I have written down here. And then the permanent tax cuts from 2017, standard deduction is extended, stuff like that. So the interesting part here, okay, is that and the child tax credit I talked about, estate tax exemption up to $30 million on a joint owned estate. The interesting thing is that a lot of this stuff is beneficial for companies. I will benefit quite a bit. My big concern here, though, for a lot of people is that we end up thinking through the theory that Trumpsky has put out, but it didn't work in his first term. You know, if we decrease taxes, we think that there's an immediate, we will have a larger gross amount of people paying taxes, and that in turn is going to lead to a better response. And if we think through the lens of those 5 areas, defense, infrastructure, healthcare, elderly and poor, and debt. If we're spending more money on debt than we did on defense, that's a big concern of mine, that long term we're not setting ourselves up for the future. Based off of a lot of projections, this bill is going to potentially add $3 trillion to that expanding deficit, right? And I think that that's a growing concern, especially with the interest rates where they're at right now, is that that's just continuing to sort of lead to some issues federally. And so I think for normal people, I think some people that are struggling, you're going to feel that, you know, if you struggle with healthcare, if you're making, you know, under 50K a year, you're going to struggle. You're going to feel it, but it still doesn't change what you need to do. And what I think it always comes back to is dotting those financial I's, crossing those financial T's. You still have to make more income than your expenses, okay? And we know, still going back, based off the jobs report, based off of how much people are working, people are only working 34 hours a week. So as a normal person, what can you do? You can create side hustles. You can try to drive Uber. You can, you know, be a landscaper or work an extra 20 hours a week so that you're working 50 to 60 hours a week so that you can pay those bills off and try to get ahead as much as possible. That's the only out that we are going to have. Okay, you've got to get creative. You got to try to start some type of side business, or you got to try and work your way up and become more valuable to your employer to make it so that you can make more money and still have some type of success. So we can bitch and moan about what this tax bill is, or we can also love it because it is favorable for a lot of populations. But at the end of the day, there's not much that we can do as normal people to complain about the way that the government is choosing to spend. I think a lot of people do need to really go back and just think through, like, what is the purpose of the government? And if you can answer that question, that should help you as sort of like that guideline. And I truly believe it goes back to those 5 key areas. Do you have debt? What's the defense that we are offering? And we are spending a lot of money in defense. Some of that stuff can be questionable, but we are spending money in defense, which is great, but we're not doing anything to decrease the debt. We're not really doing anything overly positive, elderly and poor wise. And I do think as a country, based on how we were founded, I think that's got to be part of the sinews of our morality. And then I also think that we've got to factor in what is the healthcare aspect and what is the infrastructure that we should be providing for everybody in our country to have some type of success so that we can continue to increase the tax revenue so we have government. So I hope this helps somebody out there, at least provided a unique perspective on Trumpsky's big, beautiful bill. Peace.